When most people imagine the private life of a Chinese emperor, they conjure up images of silk-draped chambers, languid beauty, and unchecked indulgence, as though the Son of Heaven reclined each night in some endless orgy of luxury. In reality, nothing could be further from the truth. The emperor's bedroom, supposedly the most intimate place in the Forbidden City, was less a sanctuary than a fortress of ritual where spontaneity was banished and every gesture choreographed with the precision of a military drill. To the modern eye, it might look absurd. Before he could so much as share a glance with one of his many consorts, layers of officials, eunuchs, and ceremonial traditions dictated how the evening would unfold, who could be present, and even when the emperor was permitted to fall asleep. Absolute power, as it turned out, came wrapped in red tape and guarded by men who had given up more than their voices to serve the dynasty. Every evening was an exercise in regulation masquerading as intimacy. Officials supervised the lighting of lanterns, eunuchs whispered instructions like stage directors at a grim opera, and the emperor himself, the most powerful man in the empire, was reduced to an actor reciting lines written centuries earlier. Privacy was unthinkable, indeed dangerous, for a ruler who could be undone by poison, seduction, or a badly chosen mistress. So the harem became a theater of control, its rules designed less for pleasure and more for survival. It is almost comical to consider that while poets romanticized emperors as gods of desire, in truth, their nights were bound tighter than their brocade robes, each encounter supervised, timed, and documented until intimacy itself became just another function of state. The irony, of course, is that the emperor, believed to wield cosmic authority, was himself a prisoner of protocol, his personal life carved up by tradition and politics. Far from indulging in passion, he lay at the center of a bureaucratic ballet, where officials scurried in the shadows, eunuchs recorded every breath, and the chosen woman was less a lover than an appointed participant in a spectacle of power. The myth of unrestrained pleasure evaporates when set against the reality of meticulous inspection, ritual ablutions, and the silent, watchful eyes of those who existed only to ensure nothing, absolutely nothing, strayed from the prescribed path. To imagine the emperor as a libertine is to miss the cruel comedy of the situation. The man who ruled millions could not even choose how to spend his own night without a checklist, a committee, and a small army of attendants, making sure the empire's image of purity and control remained intact. In that sense, the bedroom of the Forbidden City was perhaps the most forbidden place of all, where duty conquered desire, and where even the act most private to ordinary mortals was elevated, or demoted, to a matter of imperial bureaucracy. The nightly ritual of selecting a companion from the imperial harem was cloaked in an illusion of spontaneity, yet at its core it was as contrived and political as the empire itself, embodied in the curious ceremony of the jade plaques. Each evening, the emperor was presented with a tray, carried solemnly by the chief eunuch, upon which rested small polished tablets of cool jade, each inscribed with the name of a concubine or consort. To the uninitiated eye, it might have seemed a scene of luxury, a ruler free to indulge in whimsy by choosing a partner at will. But in truth, the arrangement of those plaques was rarely accidental, and the emperor's choice often less his own than the product of subtle maneuverings behind the scenes. Court advisors and influential eunuchs knew the stakes well. A night in the emperor's chamber could elevate a woman, her clan, and her political allies to dizzying new heights of influence, while the neglect of another could signal decline, disgrace, or even the extinction of a family's hopes at court. Thus, the tray became a battlefield in miniature, a quiet space where families waged war with whispers and gifts, and where the order in which names appeared could tilt the balance of power. Eunuchs with no sons of their own became power brokers, able to sway dynastic currents by nudging a plaque slightly forward, ensuring one name caught the emperor's eye before the others. Advisors might orchestrate a pattern that gave prominence to certain families to maintain alliances, avoid unrest, or balance the volatile rivalries of the palace. The emperor, surrounded by ceremony, might flip a plaque with a gesture that seemed casual, even dismissive, Yet that moment could decide the fates of ministers, generals, and provinces alike, for the woman selected was not merely a companion for an evening, but often a vehicle for dynastic continuity and political favor. Records were kept with painstaking detail, ensuring that each encounter was documented for posterity and legitimacy. But beneath the neat lines of calligraphy lay the invisible fingerprints of manipulation. The jade itself, prized for purity and virtue, added an ironic note to this theater of control, as though the stone's symbolism could mask the undercurrents of ambition and intrigue that dictated its placement on the tray. Some emperors were aware of these games and sought to outwit them, choosing seemingly at random to frustrate schemers, while others allowed themselves to be guided, willingly or not, by the invisible hand of palace politics. In this way, the supposed intimacy of the bedroom became a continuation of governance by other means, the tray of jade plaques an extension of the throne room, and desire itself bent into a tool of statecraft. What appeared to be a personal choice was in reality a public act dressed in private clothes, the emperor performing freedom in a ritualized dance that masked just how deeply his life, even in the most intimate corners, was choreographed by others. Time, that most elusive and precious of currencies, was never truly the emperor's to spend as he pleased, not even in the most private chambers of the Forbidden City, for even his hours of intimacy were portioned out by the state like rations of rice, carefully measured, documented, and curtailed with the precision of a tax ledger. Imagine the scene. Behind the crimson walls, in the golden glow of lantern light, an emperor reclines with the supposed freedom of the Son of Heaven, yet beyond the silken curtains stand watchful eunuchs, ears attuned to the passing minutes, ready to intervene should desire run longer than policy allowed. 1 hour, no more, no less, was the sanctioned allotment of closeness, after which the delicate knock or whispered call of a eunuch would puncture the pretense of intimacy like a bureaucratic alarm clock. If silence greeted them, they were instructed to enter discreetly, not for curiosity, but for safety, because nothing in the palace was left to chance, and the well-being of the emperor outweighed any notion of privacy. What might strike modern sensibilities as absurd, the timed scheduling of passion, was in fact the ultimate manifestation of imperial control, for the dynasty feared not only assassination in the dark, but also the greater danger of favoritism, the possibility that a woman could monopolize the emperor's attention and tilt the political balance of the realm. By equalizing the length of each encounter, the system sought to ensure fairness, or at least the appearance of it, preventing one concubine from gaining an advantage by lingering in the emperor's bed longer than her rivals. Yet the irony is delicious. The man thought to command the heavens was himself bound by the ticking of water clocks and the vigilance of eunuchs scribbling notes in the corridors, reducing his supposed pleasures to scheduled appointments on an invisible calendar of duty. These encounters became less about love or lust than about regulation, the careful choreography of power disguised as intimacy. Every second carried weight, every moment was observed in some ledger, for the eunuchs documented not just who entered the chamber, but when, how long she stayed, and when she returned, leaving behind a paper trail of desire turned into data. And in this bureaucratic theater, the emperor, ostensibly master of all, was reduced to an actor performing within the allotted time slot, subject to the same enforcement as any official, exceeding his office hours. This rigid system turned romance into arithmetic, as if love itself could be distilled into a unit of 60 minutes, no more than a business meeting, no less than a duty to the dynasty. To break the rule was not simply indulgence, but a threat to the balance of court life, for the palace was a hive of rivalries where even whispers of favoritism could ignite factions, rebellion, and bloodshed. Thus, intimacy was not intimacy at all, but a performance of fairness, a tool of survival, a ceremony in which the emperor, far from the indulgent libertine of legend, played the part of a man whose most personal moments were timed, supervised, and reduced to another act of governance within the ever-watchful empire of rules. If you think a concubine's evening with the emperor began with perfume and poetry, you've been misled by centuries of romantic paintings and operas, because in truth, it started in a bathtub, or rather, in a basin of water brewed like an apothecary's cauldron, infused with herbs and oils more exotic than a merchant's caravan. This was no leisurely soak with candles. It was a state-sanctioned ritual disguised as hygiene, a performance of purification as much for the empire's peace of mind as for the emperor's supposed pleasure. The belief ran deep. A woman's body was not merely her own, but a vessel of fortune, fertility, and dynastic continuity, and like any vessel it had to be scoured and sanctified before it could be presented to the Son of Heaven. So attendants poured in ingredients said to ward off evil spirits, cleanse ill luck, and invigorate reproductive powers, as if a pinch of ginseng or a few petals of chrysanthemum could guarantee an heir to the throne. The poor girl, stripped of any ornament and dignity, became less a beloved companion than a sacred offering, scrubbed and polished until she resembled a lacquered figurine of piety and obedience. There is irony here, of course, because while the poets wrote of spontaneous embraces under moonlight, the reality was closer to a factory line. Wash, wrap, inspect, deliver. The water may have steamed, the air may have smelled sweet, but the message was cold. Your body is a matter of state, your skin another page in the empire's long ledger of control. Some emperors, no doubt, appreciated the ritual, imagining that perfumed oils would draw them closer to immortality, or at least keep them safe from disease, while others probably grew weary of the parade of women who all smelled alike, as if intimacy had been standardized to avoid any dangerous surprises. The eunuchs, of course, supervised it all, ensuring that not a single drop of this sacred brew went unaccounted for, as though a misplaced lotus leaf might topple a dynasty. What makes it almost comic is the pretense of spirituality wrapped around what was essentially paranoia, fear of poison, fear of contagion, fear of impurity, so that the bath became a stage on which the empire played out its obsession with control. And yet, beneath the layers of ritual, one imagines the women themselves, weary of being boiled like dumplings in medicinal broth, forced to smile and step into the silk robe embroidered with symbols of harmony, as if embroidery could mend the imbalance between power and vulnerability. The truth is, this ritual of bathing was not about beauty or romance, but about ensuring that every encounter with the emperor was safe, regulated, and fertile, turning something as ordinary as washing into a grand theatrical act of governance. In the end, the concubine's bath was less about her than about him, less about cleansing her body than about cleansing the emperor's conscience, so that he could believe his bed was free of misfortune, and that his empire, like the water in the basin, was purified each night by the sacrifice of a woman's privacy. After the steaming bath of herbs and oils had scrubbed her clean of both dirt and dignity, the concubine's next transformation came swaddled not in passion, but in silk, as if fabric alone could stitch together the contradictions of her existence. She was not dressed so much as wrapped, cocooned like a ceremonial relic in robes designed less for warmth than for symbolism. A single embroidered covering or blanket, heavy with stitched dragons, phoenixes, and blossoms, each motif whispering of harmony, fertility, and luck, as though the fate of the dynasty depended on needlework rather than governance. Here lies the comedy. While the empire's borders strained against barbarians, while taxes crushed the peasantry, while mandarins plotted and schemed in the halls of power, inside the Forbidden City, an army of seamstresses waged their own quiet campaign, convinced that the right stitch could stabilize heaven and earth. The robe was not chosen for her comfort. Concubines had no need of comfort, but for the message it sent, that she entered the emperor's chamber not as a woman, but as an emblem of cosmic order, a bolt of living brocade draped across his bed. Imagine the absurdity of passion wrapped in bureaucracy. A young woman, freshly scalded from her ritual bath, draped in cloth so embroidered it weighed as much as armor, expected to inspire desire while embodying duty, her very body turned into a canvas for auspicious patterns. And yet this was no frivolity. The symbolism mattered. The peony might promise prosperity, the lotus purity, the dragon virility, each thread meant to protect the emperor from misfortune and bind the empire's fate to his bedchamber. What could be more imperial than reducing intimacy to a contest of embroidery? It was not enough for her to be beautiful, compliant, or even fertile. She had to resemble a tapestry come to life, an object of art placed at the feet of the Son of Heaven, proof that even silk could be conscripted into the machinery of statecraft. To modern eyes, it might appear quaint, romantic even, but it was in fact suffocatingly practical. No jewelry, no weapons, nothing that could threaten him. Just silk, stitched and inspected, as if fabric could neutralize both passion and danger. And in this swaddling, the concubine became both ornament and instrument, her individuality erased beneath layers of meaning not her own. The irony, of course, is that while historians remember the emperor as a figure of absolute power, the real authority sometimes rested in the tiny stitches of anonymous women in palace workshops, their needles dictating what luck, harmony, or fertility would accompany him into the night. Thus, the robe became not clothing but a contract, a soft prison of silk where duty was sewn into every thread, and the concubine, instead of stepping forward as herself, was presented as a bundle of symbols, a stitched prophecy carried into the emperor's bed, silken proof that in the Forbidden City, even desire had to be embroidered with meaning. If you imagine the emperor's chosen concubine gliding gracefully from her chamber, adorned in jewels and silks like some porcelain goddess, then you've clearly been reading too much romantic poetry and not enough palace regulations. Because before she could take a single step toward the dragon throne, she had to endure what can only be described as history's least glamorous strip search. Jewelry, forbidden, hairpins, confiscated, perfume bottles, trinkets, embroidered sashes with hidden pockets? Absolutely not. The woman who was meant to embody grace and allure was reduced to near blankness, her beauty pared down to flesh and cloth, as though intimacy itself were a crime scene waiting to be secured. The reasoning, of course, was simple enough. Paranoia in silk. The emperor's enemies were legion, and what better way to smuggle poison or a blade than in the elaborate folds of a concubine's robe? So eunuchs, those tireless guardians of chastity and control, conducted their inspections with the diligence of customs officers, pawing through every layer of fabric, scrutinizing every ribbon, and ensuring that no ornament could double as a weapon. Irony drips from this ritual. In the most luxurious palace on earth, a place dripping with jade and gold, the one woman invited to share the emperor's bed was barred from carrying even a hairpin, lest she turn seductress into assassin. Imagine the absurdity of a dynasty so insecure that a silk sleeve was considered a potential threat to imperial stability. And yet, this was not just about safety. It was also about hierarchy. By stripping away adornments, the palace stripped away individuality. The concubine entered the emperor's presence not as herself, but as a neutral vessel, devoid of self-expression, a woman reduced to her biological and ceremonial functions. The irony deepens when you consider that while the emperor could not trust his lovers with a necklace, he trusted them with the future of his dynasty, expecting them to bear heirs while denying them the slightest shard of autonomy. It is almost comic to picture a trembling young woman, freshly bathed, swaddled in silk, standing before a poker-faced eunuch who peers at her as though she were contraband. Romantic? Hardly. This was the empire at its most neurotic, turning love into logistics, desire into security protocol. And if the eunuchs seemed overzealous, it was because they knew the stakes. One slip, one overlooked trinket could spell the collapse of their fragile place in the hierarchy. So the inspections persisted, ritualized and relentless, until the concubine was transformed into the safest object in the palace, unarmed, undecorated, and utterly compliant. The legend of the emperor as the great lover crumbles in this light. What lover fears a jeweled hairpin? What man of boundless power demands such thorough frisking of his chosen companion? The truth, less flattering and more revealing, is that even in the sanctum of the imperial bedchamber, power was maintained not through passion, but through paranoia. And the concubine's greatest allure was not her beauty or charm, but the certainty that she carried nothing sharper than a sigh. Of all the bizarre inventions of imperial paranoia, none was more theatrical or more humiliating than the rule that concubines must be carried to the emperor's chambers on silk-draped stretchers, as though they were fragile relics instead of living, breathing women. The reasoning, naturally, was wrapped in the usual package of security and symbolism. By lifting them off the ground, the palace ensured that no concubine could conceal a weapon or poison in her shoes, no suspicious object could rattle beneath her feet, and, perhaps most importantly, that she could not wander unpredictably through the forbidden city's labyrinth of corridors. What modern eyes might see as luxury, an elegant litter borne by eunuchs, was in truth another layer of control, a system designed not to pamper but to immobilize. The woman chosen for the night was transformed into a parcel, carefully wrapped in silk, strapped to a stretcher, and carted off like imperial cargo under the silent escort of men who themselves had been stripped of manhood to guarantee their loyalty. Romantic? Hardly. The procession was more funeral than festival, the concubine borne along corridors dimly lit by lanterns, watched by guards whose faces betrayed no interest, her body swaying not to the rhythm of music, but to the uneven steps of eunuchs trained in obedience. Every element shouted suspicion. The act of walking, that most basic human freedom, was considered dangerous when performed by a woman in proximity to the Son of Heaven. To set her feet upon the palace stones was to risk subversion, to invite the possibility that she might slip something beneath her soles, or, heaven forbid, attempt to escape. And so she was carried, not because she was treasured, but because she was mistrusted. The irony runs thick. The emperor, presented in legend as the supreme master of all under heaven, apparently trembled at the thought of what a concubine might tuck into her sandal. The Son of Heaven feared a shoe. What historians often paint as ritualized elegance was, in fact, ritualized suspicion. Even the silk coverings that adorned the stretcher served less as luxury than as disguise, ensuring the woman's body was shielded from sight, cloaked in a veil of control as she was transported like a sealed offering to the altar of imperial desire. One can almost imagine her thoughts, bathed, inspected, stripped of jewelry, now swaddled and carried. Where in this routine was she herself, the woman beneath the silks? She was not a partner, not even fully a person in this moment, but an object in transit, her role reduced to submission in motionless silence. For the eunuchs, too, this was a performance of loyalty, their strength demonstrated not in battle, but in the silent, ritualized carrying of women who themselves had been reduced to symbols. The paradox is clear. In a palace famed for its riches, the emperor's most intimate encounters were choreographed with the grim efficiency of prison transfers. In the end, the stretcher was not about grandeur, nor even about security, but about reinforcing the truth that in the Forbidden City, every step, literal and figurative, belonged not to the women, not even to the emperor, but to the invisible machinery of control that governed them both. In the theater of the Forbidden City, where every gesture was codified and every breath recorded, perhaps the most telling rule of all was the one that silenced the women themselves. A concubine was forbidden to speak first to the emperor, as though her voice, uninvited, might topple the balance of heaven and earth. Imagine the irony. Poets and painters for centuries imagined these women as sirens of wit and beauty, whispering clever lines that enchanted the Son of Heaven, when in truth their tongues were shackled by protocol. She could not greet him, flatter him, or even murmur a word unless he decided she was worth hearing. Her silence was not modesty, but law, a reminder that she existed as an accessory to his will, never its challenger. In a palace where the emperor's meal was inspected, his lovers bathed in ritual water, and his hours timed like appointments on an imperial calendar, even words became dangerous objects, too sharp to be left unsupervised. The silence served two purposes. It reinforced hierarchy, reminding everyone that the emperor alone initiated intimacy, and it protected him from the hazards of charm, persuasion, or worse, information he had not chosen to hear. To speak without leave was to risk punishment, to step out of role, to shatter the fiction that this grand machinery of ritual was anything but orderly. And so, in those gilded chambers, the most powerful man in the world entertained companions who were trained above all else to keep quiet, waiting like actors off stage for their cue. The irony is painful and comic in equal measure. In the most carefully choreographed bedroom in history, the emperor, imagined as the great conqueror of hearts, lay surrounded by women who could not even say good evening unless he first opened the door with a word. Here, intimacy was not conversation, but obedience, not the meeting of two souls, but the assertion of one man's supremacy in silence. In a palace where even silence was choreographed, it should come as no surprise that intimacy itself was logged like state revenue, tallied and preserved in records as precise as any tax ledger. Every visit, every hour spent, every woman summoned to the emperor's chambers was carefully written down by watchful eunuchs, who served as both guardians of ritual and accountants of desire. These were not idle notes scribbled for gossip but official documentation, critical to the dynasty's survival, for within those neat lines of calligraphy lay the answer to the most important question of empire: whose child truly carried the blood of heaven? The emperor's offspring were not simply children, they were heirs, potential rulers, embodiments of legitimacy, and in a court that thrived on suspicion and conspiracy, a misplaced night or an unrecorded visit could spark decades of civil war. Thus, the eunuchs tracked everything: the date, the time, the selected concubine, even the duration of the encounter, transforming private moments into bureaucratic entries. Imagine the irony. The emperor, master of life and death across the realm, lay under silken covers while outside his door, men hunched over brushes and scrolls, noting the exact hour when passion began and when it ended, as though intimacy could be reduced to ink strokes. What was once the realm of poets became the business of clerks, and love itself became data, audited, preserved, and stored for imperial reference. And it did not end with the night itself. When a concubine later reported a pregnancy, the records were pulled, the ledgers consulted, the scrolls unfurled to verify that yes, she had indeed been with the emperor at the proper time. In this way, the dynasty attempted to build a paper fortress around its legitimacy, ensuring that no ambitious minister, no scheming woman, no rival prince could question the lineage of the next son of heaven. Yet the comedy of control lay in the very futility of it. Passion does not always follow the clock, bodies do not always obey the record, and history itself is littered with whispers of affairs, cover-ups, and false claims, despite the mountains of ink spilled to prevent them. Still, the eunuchs soldiered on, men without families dedicating their lives to policing the family of the emperor, their pens sharp where their bodies were not, their vigilance endless because their survival depended on it. For them, a missed note or a sloppy record was not merely negligence, but treason against the cosmic order. And so, the emperor's bedchamber became an extension of the throne room, his nights a matter of statecraft, his lovers a roster, his heirs a calculation. The myth of unrestrained passion evaporates here, replaced by the reality of logbooks, registers, and archives where romance died in neat columns of dates and names. The emperor may have ruled by the mandate of heaven, but heaven itself was verified by paperwork, and every sigh of pleasure was shadowed by the scratch of a brush, making sure that even in the most intimate of acts, the empire remained firmly in control. Among the countless rituals and prohibitions that governed life in the Forbidden City, few were as peculiar, or as quietly revealing, as the rules surrounding menstruation, that most ordinary of human cycles turned into a state affair. In the grand calculus of imperial control, even a woman's body clock was folded into the machinery of governance. During her monthly cycle, a concubine was automatically barred from being chosen to share the emperor's bed. It was considered unlucky, unclean, even dangerous to his vital energy. Of course, this had little to do with biology and everything to do with superstition and paranoia. The Son of Heaven, they believed, could not risk contamination from bad fortune or weakened essence, and so the simplest of natural processes became another reason for exclusion. Yet the absurdity did not end there. Because speaking openly of menstruation was considered shameful, the palace devised a series of secret signals, a discreet language of denial. A concubine might wear a gold ring on her finger, or slip a folded note into the hands of an attendant, or tie a red ribbon around her wrist. Some hung a red lantern outside their quarters, as if advertising not welcome but retreat. The sight of such signals was supposed to protect both woman and emperor from embarrassment, sparing her the risk of being summoned when she was unavailable. But as in all things imperial, what began as practicality soon became politics. Ambitious concubines sometimes ignored the rule, concealing their condition in hopes of gaining the emperor's favor on a night that might change their fortunes forever. Others manipulated the system, feigning unavailability to avoid the emperor's displeasure or arranging signals to time their appearances with greater advantage. Predictably, this delicate balance of secrecy and ambition left the eunuchs with yet another thankless duty. They were ordered to keep detailed records of every woman's cycle, transforming intimacy into paperwork and turning bodies into bureaucratic schedules. Imagine the irony. Men who could no longer produce children themselves became custodians of the imperial womb, charting dates with the precision of astronomers, guarding against lies with the vigilance of jailers. The emperor, meanwhile, sat at the center of this menstrual ledger, his private life reduced to a matter of red ribbons, lanterns, and notes, his very virility dependent on a system of signals and surveillance. And here lies the comedy. The ruler of millions, believed to command the heavens, was steered by the quiet flutter of a ribbon or the flicker of a lantern outside a door, as if his cosmic power could be undone by a trick of timing. What was meant as reverence, protecting his sacred body from ill luck, was in truth another cage, another demonstration that even desire was bound by superstition, protocol, and fear. In the end, menstruation in the Forbidden City was not merely a biological reality, but a political inconvenience, disguised beneath symbols and whispers, watched over by eunuchs, and exploited by rivals. It was, like everything else in that gilded prison, proof that in the emperor's world, nothing, not even the most private rhythms of the body, escaped the empire's obsession with control. In the gilded prison of the Forbidden City, beauty was never simply beauty, and affection was never merely affection. The emperor's favorite concubines became living banners around which political factions rallied, their silken sleeves fluttering like war standards in the endless battles of court intrigue. To win the emperor's attention was not just to bask in personal favor, but to unlock the ambitions of entire clans who saw in one woman's nightly summons the chance to tip the empire's balance in their direction. Ministers whispered her name in corridors, eunuchs courted her attendance with gifts, and rivals sharpened their smiles while secretly plotting her downfall. The bedroom, in effect, became an annex of the throne room, its pillows a stage for alliances and betrayals. The irony, of course, is that the emperor, who imagined himself the axis of heaven and earth, was often manipulated by the very women who supposedly lived only to serve him. A lingering glance, a clever smile, or a well-timed tear could shift appointments, promotions, even the fate of military campaigns across distant borders. Yet the danger of such influence was as great as its allure. To be too beloved was to invite envy, to gather enemies like moths to a flame, until one's beauty became a liability rather than a gift, a crown that weighed more heavily with every passing day. Some concubines played the game masterfully, weaving networks of loyalty, debt, and fear, building silent armies of servants and allies to protect their position, while others, less adept, were consumed quickly by the jealousies they provoked and discarded like broken ornaments. The palace rang with silken footsteps, murmured flattery, and the faint rustle of plots being spun, but beneath its lacquered screens and carved golden dragons lay a battlefield every bit as brutal, as treacherous, and as unforgiving as the empire's blood-soaked frontiers. And the favored concubine, idolized, adorned, and paraded as a symbol of imperial grace, stood not as a cherished companion, but as a contested prize in the ceaseless war of politics, disguised as love. Her beauty a weapon, her charm a currency, her survival a constant gamble. In the long catalogue of imperial eccentricities, few episodes glitter so darkly as the reign of the emperor obsessed with immortality, who turned the women of his harem into unwilling test subjects for his alchemical dreams. History likes to remember emperors as builders of palaces, patrons of the arts, or commanders of armies, but this particular sovereign fancied himself a sorcerer, determined to outwit time itself with potions that promised eternal life. The irony, of course, was that his quest for immortality proved lethally effective at delivering the opposite. Each evening, while the court whispered prayers for the empire's stability, the emperor summoned his concubines not for pleasure or companionship, but to swallow concoctions brewed in the shadowed laboratories of Taoist alchemists, mixtures of mercury, arsenic, and other noxious ingredients disguised as celestial elixirs. The women were expected to drink without protest, their loyalty measured not in affection, but in their willingness to risk their lives for his delusion. To refuse was unthinkable. To comply was often fatal. The palaces that should have echoed with music and laughter instead became chambers of coughing, weakness, and sudden death. The eunuchs, who already recorded every moment of intimacy, now became grim witnesses to the slow poisoning of the emperor's companions, carrying away pale, trembling concubines whose beauty faded not from age but from toxins swirling in their veins. Some women died quickly, collapsing in silken robes that still smelled faintly of incense. Others lingered, growing gaunt and listless, their decline noted with bureaucratic precision in the palace registers. The emperor, blinded by his obsession, seemed unfazed by the mounting toll, convinced that if he swallowed enough glittering powders and shared them with his harem, the secret of eternal youth would one day reveal itself. It was a cruel inversion of intimacy. Instead of receiving comfort, the women became test subjects, their bodies offered up to science twisted into superstition. But the palace could only endure so much. Fear turned into resentment, resentment into whispers, and whispers into conspiracy. Among the concubines, alliances formed, not for favor or advancement this time, but for survival. It is said that a group of desperate women, weakened yet unbroken, plotted to assassinate the emperor, believing that death was preferable to another drop of his lethal medicine. Their attempt failed, as such plots almost always did within the heavily guarded labyrinth of the Forbidden City, and the punishment that followed was merciless. Executions were carried out with ritual severity, sending a clear message to the survivors. Loyalty was demanded, even at the cost of life itself. The irony of the emperor's obsession lies not only in its cruelty, but in its futility. The elixirs that were meant to cheat death hastened it instead, robbing him of companions and corroding his own health. He grew paranoid, ill and isolated, a man surrounded not by symbols of youth and vitality, but by the memory of women sacrificed to his fantasy. The tragedy of these dangerous experiments is that they were not accidents of ignorance, but deliberate acts of imperial will, carried out in the name of eternal life, yet leaving only death in their wake. And so the story stands, a dark reminder that even in the most gilded palaces, the pursuit of immortality can turn love into laboratory work, devotion into danger, and beauty into collateral damage of a dream too poisonous to realize. Yang Guifei, whose name still lingers in the poetry and operas of China, was no ordinary concubine. She was the embodiment of beauty elevated to political peril, a woman whose charms both enchanted an emperor and destabilized an empire. During the Tang Dynasty, she rose from obscurity to become the beloved companion of Emperor Xuanzong, her presence at his side transforming her into more than a consort. She became a symbol of the empire's refinement, indulgence, and ultimately, its vulnerability. Xuanzong adored her with a fervor that eclipsed reason. He granted her favors, bestowed titles upon her family, and allowed her influence to seep into matters of state. Ministers grumbled, generals seethed, and courtiers whispered. But the emperor remained blind, convinced that heaven itself had favored him with a goddess disguised as a woman. Yet, the empire was not blind. As unrest spread, as military campaigns faltered, and as corruption gnawed at the Tang bureaucracy, resentment turned its gaze not toward the emperor, who had retreated into music and pleasure, but toward the woman who seemed to hold him captive. Yang Guifei became the scapegoat, her beauty recast as poison, her influence described as treasonous, her very existence blamed for rebellions that threatened to topple the dynasty. The climax came with the Anlushan Rebellion, a civil war so devastating it shook the Tang dynasty to its foundations. Armies marched, cities burned, and millions perished, while the emperor, fleeing the chaos, carried his beloved with him. Yet, as soldiers muttered and commanders stewed, their patience dissolved. Exhausted, hungry, and enraged, they demanded her death, declaring that the survival of the throne required the sacrifice of the woman they held responsible for the empire's collapse. Xuanzang, trapped between love and loyalty, hesitated, but his hesitation was brief. Surrounded by generals whose swords had preserved his life in the flight from rebellion, he yielded to their demand. Yang Guifei was taken to a nearby temple, where the choice of her death remains blurred by history. Whether she strangled herself with a silken cord or was executed under imperial order is still debated. But what is certain is that her life ended not in the splendor of the palace, but in quiet despair, abandoned by the man who once swore devotion. The irony is cutting. The emperor, who could not bear to be without her, was forced by his own soldiers to offer her life as the price of their loyalty. And yet, her death did not heal the empire. The rebellion raged on, the dynasty staggered forward, and Xuanzang, broken by grief, retreated from power, haunted by the ghost of the woman he had loved too much. History, however, did not let her vanish. Poets transformed her into a tragic heroine, painters captured her beauty as eternal, and playwrights immortalized her as both victim and enchantress. To the court that condemned her, she was a liability. To the people, she became legend. Yang Guifei's story is not just of love destroyed by politics, but of politics undone by love. A reminder that in the gilded world of emperors and concubines, beauty was never a gift without cost, and affection, once tangled with power, could end not in bliss but in betrayal, exile, and death remembered for centuries.